Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the really fascinating, but sadly long out of print and little discussed, Random House book series of Young Indiana Jones books. Now, these were obviously done for a younger reader, so it's part of the children's book market, and most might think it was actually tied in and another part of the merchandising surrounding the Young Indy Chronicles television series. But these actually predate the television series and lasted from 1990 to 1995 across 15 books. But the series actually had a sort of break, and I guess maybe that had to do with the TV series. This does not follow the TV series at all and has a sort of it does actually fit in the Indy canon. That's the fascinating part. But it was started when, of course, there were only 3 films. The book started in 1990 and went through the first 8, which I have behind me, and these were published between the years of 1990 and 1991. Then there was a gap, and in 1993, the series restarted, continuing the line with Book 9, and then lasted through Book 15, which came out in 1995. I think the reason for this is probably due to the TV series starting around this time point, and I think somebody at Lucasfilm maybe was a bit concerned that there was this ongoing Young Indiana Jones series that might conflict with the new canon they were sort of building for Indy's backstory, but then I guess maybe that got ironed out or something, and then Random House kept going. The first 8 books are usually the ones you're able to find. That's why I have them behind me. They are still increasingly difficult to find, and it took me quite a long time to piece together just the first 8. But once you get to Book 9, they seem to have been printed in far less quantities, so it's difficult to find any of the first 8 books, but books 9 through 15 are absurdly difficult to find, and so that's why I'm only able to talk about the first 8, because I've only been able to read and purchase copies of the first 8. The later books in the series usually go for quite high prices, and at present there are some absurdly expensive listings on eBay, particularly for the last couple of books. So if you're interested in this series, do keep in mind they've never been reprinted, and you do have to track down original copies, and they weren't printed in very great quantities, it seems, outside of the first 2 or so books. So you can usually find decent, cheap copies of, say, Plantation Treasure and Tomb of Terror, which are the first 2 books. And then as you start going along, books 3 and 4 are a little bit less common, and then when you get to books 5 through 8, they get increasingly less common, and then by book 9, you're just, scouring eBay or hoping other indie fans are selling their collections because they just dry up. And also, apparently, from book 9 through 15, Random House switched over to using their Bullseye imprint. So it just seems like they printed less, and this became less of a thing that was being promoted because the focus was on the TV series, which famously alternated between Indy at 2 different ages, played by 2 actors, and having Indy interact with various famous figures and events in history, as the TV series approach was for edutainment, is really the term of mixing education in history with entertainment, and that was the series approach. It didn't gel with everyone, but that was the unique aspect of the TV series. Well, these books don't really have that in terms of their approach. And that's actually interesting when you come and look at these particular Young Indy books in this Random House series, because it actually doesn't have the same issues of the television series being edutainment in its approach. But what the books do is they actually keep the sort of core of that idea, because young Indy, who's about, I'd say, 13 or 14 over the course of these books, and he does age up a little bit. I would assume when you get to the end, book 15, he should be a little bit older. But what these books do is have Indy travel to different exotic locations and interact with locals and also elements of history, and weave it into an adventure story that is unique for that particular volume. So it actually does promote studying history and culture for a school-age audience, but it doesn't hit you over the head like the TV series could at times. And it also doesn't feel really forced to have Indy meeting specific people or being involved in specific events as the TV series could. So if you had issues with the approach of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles in terms of the design of it, these books are going to be right up your alley. And what they also do is at the end, they include a glossary of terms and historical events, and also essentially a works cited or suggested reading list. So kids, if interested, could actually dig further into history. And there seems to have been a conscious desire to have real history and historical figures in these books, but not allow that to interfere with the adventure narrative. So there is a little bit of riffing on history a little bit, and not trying to do it specifically as if you were reading a section in a history book, but then you get the notes at the end to address any of that and point kids to actually going to historical texts and essentially boning up on that particular area of history once they've gotten interested by this indie adventure they've read. So for me, this was a total shock, because I came to these thinking that, this is just another part of the indie merchandising. It was another attempt to involve school children and get them maybe invested in history a little bit. But these are slim little volumes that nobody talks about. So you wouldn't think that they're frankly worth all that much in terms of the text content. And then when you start looking at the dates, you realize, oh, well, this is actually a couple years before the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles TV series. So this will be interesting, because at this point, all we had was the opening of Last Crusade with the River Phoenix iteration of Young Indy. That was the only Young Indy thing there was, and we had 3 films, and that was it. So what these books do is essentially give you more of the film experience, because each of these is a small, quite frankly, well-crafted little pulpy adventure with a 13 or 14-year-old Indiana Jones still trying to find himself, still having the burgeoning sense of adventure and interest in archaeology and history, and dealing with essentially living under his father's thumb and dealing with his resentment towards Henry Sr. and all the character elements that were set up in the opening of Last Crusade that would develop into the Indy we know and love. And of course, I can only talk about the first 8 books, but this would carry on into the later books for the most part. These books are just well done. They are fun little adventures. Yes, they're ostensibly for young readers, and they are quite short, but these are mini indie movies. They are basically just like the opening of Last Crusade, but if it was expanded to, you could actually envision each of these as a television episode of a Young Indy series. All of them fit inside the Indy canon, and they're engaging pulpy adventures. So if you have issues with the Young Indy Chronicles TV series, if you didn't like its approach, or you always wished it had been more like the films, this is what you want. These have elements of the supernatural. These have villains. These have peril and threats of death, and even early burgeoning sort of love interests, because Indy is getting into the sort of teenage years and starts to deal with that. And he travels the world and engages with history and local culture, and the canon building in terms of working these books into the Indy mythology that was developing at the time. It fits perfectly. It may contrast and not quite work 100% with some of the stuff they did in the TV series, but that came later, and these fit perfectly into the films. In book 2, Indy meets Sala for the first time, and they have a whole adventure in Egypt, and it's fantastic, and it's perfect for how Indy meets Sala for the first time. And the characterizations are spot on. The young Indy in these books feels exactly like how I would imagine a 14-year-old Indiana Jones would be. He's not quite the Indy of Temple and Raiders, but everything fits, and it also is the perfect middle point between the River Phoenix young Indy at the opening of Last Crusade and Indy as we see him in Temple of Doom in 1935 in terms of the chronology and timeline. And there's a development of the character across these books. We even have some recurring characters from earlier books. For example, the heroine and sort of quasi love interest of the first book actually appears in book 8. So there is a continuity to these, which again, I didn't expect either. And sometimes later books will refer back to Indy remembering, hey, remember that time I almost died in an Egyptian tomb because I wound up actually dealing with an archaeologist who was actually a Nazi and stuff? Yeah, I remember that. Or the time I almost got killed in a battle of magic at Stonehenge? Yeah, I remember that. But it's actually tied into these books. So there's a series continuity, which, again, totally unexpected. You can definitely feel that this series was done to try and recapture the experience of the films, to try and capture a sense of history and global culture, and give kids the sense of the adventure of travel and studying other cultures and getting involved in history, but trying to make sure they still felt like the films. Some books are a little better than others, and I think one or two do go maybe a little bit too far into the supernatural, which is always the sort of danger factor when you have an indie story, because there should be a supernatural element, but you can't go too far into that because then that can take it into fantasy or science fiction territory. So, for example, in Circle of Death, as depicted on the cover, the climax does actually involve a sort of battle of wills and magic at Stonehenge, and it's just a little much in places. But again, it still works. And you do need a supernatural element in an indie story every once in a while. But for the most part, it's done extremely well and doesn't cross over into more fantasy territory, again, with one or two exceptions. But these are also pulpy. They're pulpy in the sense that they have adventure, they have drive, they have cliffhangers, they have, Indy's only 13 or 14 in these, so he's still technically a kid, but they're, in practically every book, he almost dies multiple times. And each book has a plot that is actually interesting, and we meet new characters, and Indy makes new friends and enemies, and there are legitimate villains in each book. And each one of these could be a television episode or a feature film because they're that well done. So this is some of the best indie fiction there is. These at times actually, I think, are more like the films and are actually better in some ways than some of the adult novels. This is where you find the Indiana Jones spirit, and in a lot of ways, this is actually better than the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles TV series in terms of having a young Indiana Jones series of adventures that has Indy as a youth, but still feels like the films. These feel more like the films than the TV series did, and it has Indy interact with history and various historical figures, but in a far more believable way than the TV series did. These never feel ham-fisted like they're trying to shove in history or various events or characters and things, because it instead takes the approach of taking young Indy as he's growing into the man he would become in the films and placing him in different areas and allowing the story to develop naturally and then maintaining a series continuity. It's amazing. And I think this also is helped by the fact that most of the books were written by the same two authors. For example, when you look at the books behind me for the first 8, they pretty much jumped back and forth between the two authors, William McKay and Les Martin. And then for books 9 through 15, again, they wrote most of them, but then you also had a couple other authors come in, including R.L. Stine and Megan Stein. So that means those particular books they wrote are more collectible due to the fact that you have the sort of Goosebumps association. But for most of the 15 books, you have the same two authors sort of trading back and forth. And so I think that adds to this feeling of a sort of series continuity. So I really hope I can read books 9 through 15 someday, but even just reading the first 8 books, this is the biggest surprise of getting more into the world of Indiana Jones literature and printed materials. These are miniature films. They really are. And they're not, it's not like they're long books, because again, it's deceptive. These are little thin paperback volumes. You wouldn't think they were, going to be super engaging. They have standard backgrounds. They even have the reading level printed on here, and they are, very nicely done, but very simple. We have the Indy font. We have a sort of series style. We have the chapter headings, and this, of course, looks like what you would expect from a Random House sort of small children's series done in the early 90s or late 80s. But again, these are really well done, and each one has painted cover artwork. So they have legitimate covers. They have legitimate titles that are done in the Indy style with the font. And even the titles are all great from Plantation Treasure onward. None of them have a silly, goofy title. And again, all of the plots are relatively grounded. They usually involve some sort of artifact. They always involve a particular element of history. And Indy's characterization is so spot on that it very much feels like a more developed version of the Indy from the opening of Last Crusade. And you can start to see more and more elements of the Indy of Temple and Raiders coming in. So this is right there. It's probably not midway on the timeline, but it's a little ways down. Again, this is Indy at 13, 14, and it's incredibly well done. It's perfectly tied into the canon, even though there probably are some quibbles with the Young Indy Chronicles. But these are just mini Indy films, but he's just younger. I mean, they're perfectly done. These are shocking to read for the first time because they're so well done. This is some of the best Indy literature there is. And then just give you an example, when you get to the end, each of these is somewhere around 120 pages or so in this style. But at the end, there's always a historical note that the author writes, which also explains if there's any discrepancies with history that they had simply for dramatic purposes. They actually will tell the reader about it. So they were making sure to give kids greater background. And then they have a list of suggested further reading. And then they actually take the time to explain each book. So, I mean, this is an additional touch that I find really striking because you just simply didn't always get stuff like this in children's literature, especially something that was supposed to just be a tie-in. So that's another element that I think is really well done and shows there was a commitment to trying to get kids further into history and history studies and have that education element without making it feel shoehorned in like the TV series could at times. So this is actually a better approach and a more fleshed out and well-reasoned approach than the TV series was. Now, it is a bit of a struggle to find these, but I think it's a bit easier finding the earlier books because they seem to have at least had more than one print run. And I have noticed there's a little bit of variation. So say, for example, on this copy of Book 3, Circle of Death, this, I think, is a first printing because on the back, the ad for the Lucasfilm fan club has the image of River Phoenix from Last Crusade and has a little bit different information. And then later ones would just have a generic logo for the second printing, which looks like this. So again, it seems the first couple books did at least have two different print runs. You can also tell this if you get a couple copies side by side because sometimes there's a little variation in the color of the spines and the back. So as you can see here, there's one that's definitely more green than the other. The other is a little bit more sort of like a mint green or a little bit grayish. And at first I thought it was just because of like sun damage or something or just wear of time. But no, it's actually a little bit different. And I've noticed that on a couple other of these that I've just managed to find an extra edition or something. Again, these are very uncommon, but they will pop up in bookstores. And I managed to find all 8 of these in used bookstores. I picked up one on a whim just to see what it was like, and then thought, oh, well, maybe I can find the others, not realizing how difficult it was to get the later books. So if you're patient and you look around used bookstores, usually in the children's section or young adult series, you'll occasionally find some of these, but it's going to be the first 2 to maybe 3 or 4 that you're going to see a lot. It's after that they start getting more and more rare. It's very difficult to find books 6 through 8, and then after that, you have to go to eBay, and you'll find them listed for individually volumes, like 9 through 15, anywhere from $20 or $30 each to $50 or $60 each, and then you find some listings with crazy amounts of hundreds of dollars. So this is not an easy series to collect. You just have to get really lucky and be very patient, and you're probably only going to be able to get the first 8, but just getting any of them and picking it up and reading it as an indie fan, I think, will really show you that these had great care put into them. And it's some of the most satisfying indie storytelling in printed fiction. And it's amazing that it was this little known, little discussed, very obscure, out of print Young Indiana Jones children's series from Random House that actually predates the Chronicles TV series. So for me, this is just as surprising as the Scholastic indie books being so satisfying in terms of basically being like miniature indie films where they really cared about getting the tone of the films and the characterization right and having villains and cool plots and artifacts to deal with. Except this was a long-running series with Young Indy, and for me, it's the best iteration of Young Indiana Jones in terms of capturing the spirit of the films with a younger version of our main character. All of the events of the first 8 that I've read are able to fit within the indie canon. They feel like they fit perfectly. There's nothing that jumps out of place. Each one of these is satisfying for an indie fan, and there's a nice sense of series continuity, and you can see Indy's character developing over these 8 books. I would recommend these to any indie fan. I think it's a must, and I think at least the first 8 I've been able to read it's some of the best indie storytelling there is outside of the films, which is crazy to think of, but don't overlook these, even though they're an obscure, out-of-print, hard-to-collect children's book series that ran from 1990 to 1995. They're worth your time. There's some great indie adventure storytelling in here. There's some great interactions with famous characters. Again, this is where Indy meets Sala for the first time, and it is now my preferred Indy meets Sala origin story. Each of the first 8 is satisfying, and they're still pulpy adventures. So they have the tone of the films, and Indy nearly gets killed in pretty much all of these at multiple times, and they have good historical artifact MacGuffins, they have good villains, they have good plots, they have elements of the supernatural, there's the sense of world travel, there's the sense of the further breakdown in the relationship between Henry Sr. and Indy. Everything in these is well done, and they have great titles, and they have great artwork on the covers. Yes, 1 or 2 may go a little bit too far into the supernatural for my taste, but not everybody may agree with that. But still, each one of these is well done. Each one of these could be a television episode or a feature film in terms of getting that indie spirit. And this is just one of, I think, the most important elements of Indiana Jones literature and the sort of expanded indie universe. I've never seen these discussed outside of a couple indie fan forums, and I wish I'd known about these sooner. I really do. They're that well done, they're that enjoyable, and just because they're old, hard-to-find kids' books doesn't mean they're not worth your time. So I guess the whole point of doing this video review is to try and encourage people to find some of these if you can. I do think there are 1 or 2 on the Internet Archive that you can actually borrow, and there might be a few scattered around your local library if you can find them. Again, it's finding them that's the hard part, but it's basically eBay searches and scouring used bookstores, and you might be able to find the first couple. If you're lucky, you'll be like me and be able to find the first 8. It's just books 9 through 15 that get really hard to find and very expensive very quickly. So this is not a set I think I'll be able to complete anytime soon, but hopefully I can chip away at it and find the next couple of books, because the first 8 are so good and so fun that these, along with the Scholastic books and I think the best of the Bantam adult novels, this is where you get more Indiana Jones adventures in terms of getting the spirit of the original trilogy of films. This is more indie than Crystal Skull or Dial of Destiny will ever be, and it's a little kids series from Random House that only lasted 15 volumes, and they're just well done. They're enjoyable, they're engaging, and they feel like an Indiana Jones adventure. This is what I always wanted from the Young Indy TV series. And I still love the Chronicles series, don't get me wrong. I think there are some great episodes, and they had such great production values for the time. There's so many great elements to that series, but you can never get around the sort of approach and the fact they've been re-edited over the years and had the bookends removed, and they've been combined, and all the stuff that Lucas has done with those. But all the issues I've always had with the Chronicles series, nowhere to be found in these. This is what I always wanted from a Young Indy adventure series. And it just so happened that it really did exist. I just didn't find out about it until I was an adult. So there you go. If you've read one of these, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, even if you just have some vague memories of these Random House books. These were a complete surprise. As I said in my review, I knew the Scholastic books were probably going to be really great considering the authors involved, but at least with that, I had an idea they were probably going to be really good and be good indie adventures. With these, I had no idea. I just picked up one on a whim because I found it, and then I thought, oh, well, I'll try to collect the rest of the series. And then when I started doing these reviews, I decided, well, I've got the first 8. I can at least read these, and maybe I'll find the others someday. But again, I had no idea if it was going to be worth anything, or if it was, going to be something that I wanted to invest more time and money into, in terms of I didn't know if the books were any good, essentially. And I start reading the first one, and I'm like, how did they do it? How did they do it? How did they do a better job of telling young Indiana Jones adventures and trying to get kids invested in learning more about history and different cultures than the whole TV series? And this was started before the TV series was even a thing, and when all we had were the 3 films and the Marvel comics, for example. This is definitely one of the most just completely shocking experiences of digging more into trying to read every bit of printed Indiana Jones fiction. So just because these are books for kids, I would say it's just like the Scholastic books. These are musts. It's just going to be a matter of trying to find them, which is, again, very difficult. So don't beat yourself up if you can't find all of them. But because there's a nice feeling of series continuity, I would advise trying to get as many as you can and then reading them. And they're so short and fun that you'll want to read the rest of them, and then it's frustrating because you can't. But again, it's books 9 through 15 that are much harder to find, because apparently they only had 1 print run, where at least the first 8 maybe had 2, if not 3. But I would recommend these to any Indiana Jones fan, and especially indie fans with kids, because these are well written enough and approachable enough that, of course, they're originally designed and were marketed for kids at a certain reading level, but adult fans can read them too, and they feel like the films, and they feel like indie. So again, I would put the Random House Young Indy books, at least the first 8 I've been able to read, up there with the 2 Scholastic books and the best of the Bantam novels, as being the best of Indiana Jones fiction that feels like it's replicating the character from the films, and that's replicating the tone of the original 3 films. So again, who would have thought that a kids series that predates the Chronicles TV series would be this good and this well thought out and this well executed, that for my money it's actually better than the Chronicles TV series in terms of the approach and the unity with the 3 films in terms of tone, and the fact that these still remain historically minded period pulp adventures. It just so happens that Indy is a 13 or 14-year-old instead of the adult Indy. So if you ever wanted more Indiana Jones adventures and you're just desperate for something that feels like the original 3 films, that remain pulp adventures with good titles, villains, our supporting characters, traveling the world, examining other cultures, with elements of the supernatural, and having good MacGuffins and historical artifacts, then these Random House books are for you. some of the best indie fiction there is, hands down, no contest. And I was absolutely stunned reading these. And it was another where I'm just reading these and it's like, where have you been all my life? How have I not known that these were a thing? So these are a must for any indie fan. It's just going to be trying to track all of them down and not pay $500 for a copy of book 15 on eBay. And I'm not making that up. That's an actual listing. So it gets very difficult, but at least hopefully you can pick up a couple volumes and have some more fun with our favorite archaeologist. So as always, I hope my babblings about our beloved archaeologist hero, Indiana Jones, and the world of printed Indiana Jones fiction has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, these are musts for any indie fan. Don't pass them up simply because they're old kids' books that are hard to track down. They're so worth your time, and you'll have fun reading all of them, even if you may gravitate towards some more than others, or you may prefer some more than others. So this is just another complete surprise in digging more into the obscure areas of Indiana Jones merchandising and Indiana Jones tie-in fiction and things. And again, these fit in perfectly with the indie canon. So now I can imagine more of the young Indy character and stuff that will influence the Indy of the original trilogy of films, because in these, they made sure that everything fit in the world and in the characterization, and you could see them as building blocks towards the Indy of Temple and Raiders. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some of this series of young indie books. Again, it did take me some time, but I managed to find all of the first 8 books used in local stores. So they do pop up, but you have to be very patient and check a bunch of different areas if they sort them in different places. But they do turn up sporadically, and if you're lucky like me, you can at least find the first 8. But again, books 9 through 15 are, pretty much, you have to get lucky on eBay, or you can try to get the whole series on eBay, but a whole set rarely appears, and if it does, it's usually astronomically priced. So do keep that in mind, but they are worth the time and investment in terms of tracking them down, because they're really well done, and they're easily the best young indie experience I think there is, even compared to the TV series, which again, I still have great fondness for, and I love a lot of elements, and I love certain episodes, and I think the series was well done for the time, but I've always had some issues with its approach and wish it felt more like the films in tone and didn't stress that edutainment factor, and all of those issues I have are resolved with these books. So if you ever wanted a young indie experience that felt more like the actual 3 films, this is what you need. So hopefully you're able to find some of these and have further fun with indie adventures. So keep reading print books, keep cracking the whip, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.